Well, this is the challenging topic that I have for you today, to speak about the algae market and value chains. So next slide. I will go through these three big areas. A short review about the algae industry, the market applications, and the value chains. So next, please. But first of all, in ABA, we always show this slide first to tell what are algae. So as we can see, and Robert already showed this link, this fantastic link, what are algae. But it's important to mention that currently we have several kingdoms, 7 kingdoms, not anymore 4, 7, and algae are in 4 of them, and they cover many different phylum and include cyanobacteria, it's the first phylum, but euglenoids, diatoms, so a wide range of organisms. So this is very important because we need to consolidate this idea about what are algae. It's a global name. Separating algae and saying that cyanobacteria are not algae is a big mistake and creates many, and I could stay hours telling about this, many problems in the regulatory frameworks. So cyanobacteria are algae. Next, please. Industry status. Next, please. We have in the algae world two different sizes: the macroalgae that are multicellular and the microalgae that are unicellular. They have different compositions, different characteristics, and it's also a big mistake to say that algae are this or algae are that, because they are very different. As we saw, within the algae concept, we have many different organisms in macroalgae, in microalgae. So when we say algae are a good source of, let's say, proteins or fibers, we cannot say global statements, because some algae are very good. For example, some algae are very good providing oil, but some others are not. Not all algae. So some seaweeds have 0.5% lipids. This is not good. We cannot say that these algae are good for oil. Some microalgae can go up to 70 or 80% lipids, Botrycoccus, but it's only one species, so we cannot generalize anything about algae. The only thing is that most of them are photosynthetic, but not all, because some of them lost the capacity to be photosynthetic. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. To tell you about what is the size of the algae sector, it's a very complex issue, and there are many possible sources. So we asked the company, Meticulous Research, to go into the information available in the different reports, information provided by us from our members, and consolidate that information in a few tables. So next slide, please. And we came up with this global information. It was very difficult, and this is not just to give an order of magnitude. You can see here that the numbers are, for example, in thousands of tons. The world biomass production, 150,000 tons. It's not 145, 68,000 tons. These are global numbers that are aiming to provide order of magnitude. So you will have the PowerPoint in the end. So if you want, you check the numbers. Next slide, please. Here are the species, in this case, the microalgae that are the most relevant ones. And we see here that very few species. There are hundreds, dozens of thousands of species, but only very few are viable in mass production. And we see that, for example, here, spirulina, Arthrospira, it's much higher. It's a cyanobacteria, much higher than other microalgae. and in the algae produced by fermentation, we see that also very few species. And we see that the species are different from Europe and the rest of the world. Next slide, please. Let's see the seaweed. Seaweed, it's exactly the same. We see that the species that are more relevant in the rest of the world are different from the ones in Europe, even if some are common. And this is very relevant to acknowledge and understand. So next slide, please. Let's see how they look like. Next slide, please. This one, okay. We see here how the images of the main algae, the main seaweed, very different. And again, I would say that we cannot say that 𝐀𝐥𝐸 is good as uva. So it depends on the way they are cultured. The composition changes a lot depending on where they are cultured, the way they are cultured, and so on. Next slide, please. Let's see the microalgae. Next slide, please. Here we see how they look like, the unicellular algae. Some of them are filamentous. These are just the main algae in Europe. In the rest of the world, next slide, please. Market applications. Next slide, please. We can divide the market applications in 8 big areas, and we eventually can subdivide these in others. This is just a reference to help us to think about the applications. So algae, this global thing, global name, can have many applications, but some algae are interesting for food, but they are not interesting for wastewater treatment because they are not even approved as food. Some algae can be very interesting for cosmetics, but they are different from the algae that are used for soil applications. So we cannot generalize algae are this or algae are that, and the algae can be used for this or that because different algae can be used for different purposes. Next slide, please. Here, this slide shows where microalgae and macroalgae meet. They meet because in the end of the game, in the end of the applications, most of the applications are quite common. You will see in the right side that there are only 2 exceptions. That is, microalgae are not used to produce hydrocolloids, and seaweed are not produced for biofuels yet, even if they can do it. But so we see that they combine the applications. So microalgae and macroalgae are together in the early stages when the single cells or a few cells in the lab, in the pilot scale, and also in the end for the applications. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite slides because combines, again, microalgae and macroalgae applications all across the different applications. This shows the wide variety and really one of the reasons why it is important to invest and to study algae, because they have this broad range of applications. In the top, you see the microalgae, and in the bottom, you see the macroalgae. And for the same application, you can see that there are different uses. For example, for soil amendments, for fertilizers and biostimulants, you have both microalgae and macroalgae with different roles, but very important for this application. Next slide, please. Now, let's just to finish to see what are exactly these value chains and how they are used and they are in the algae sector. So this is the definition of the value chain, and very often people don't know and don't understand what is this strange thing of value chain. I would say to start that there are 2 value chains. One is the business value chain that I will explain later, and the product value chain. This is also a recent concept from the 80s. It was Michael Porter that brought the concept. Let's see what Michael Porter says about this. Next slide, please. No, previous, yes. This is how the value chain was originally formulated. So here we see that there are many activities related to something. This is applied not only to algae, but for everything. You can apply value chain for everything. And the value chain has to do with steps from the product to the consumer. All right, and then inside of the product there are also several steps in the processing of the product. Let's see next slide. And here we see the product value chain. And to start to think about the product value chain, we need to understand that about the algae, all algae, we have mainly three types of products. We can have both for microalgae and for seaweed. We can have a paste that can have live algae or not, that can be frozen, but it's a very wet stage. Then we can have a second type of product that is a larger processing process that is dried. Algae can be dried, both seaweed and this is only a picture with microalgae, but could be the same with the seaweed. And the third type of product is extracts. We can take something from the algae. So these are the only three types of products that we can have globally obtained from algae. Next slide, please. In this product value chain, we have the product value chain that is related with the way we handle the biomass. So we can handle the biomass and have different kinds of processing of the biomass. And this shows us the product value chain. We have the production, we have the processing, and then we can have some distribution. In the business value chain, we can have from the cultivation to the applications. That's when, in the business value chain, is when the product gets to the consumer. All right, next slide. Here we see again how this logics relates. In the product value chain, the formulation is critical to develop the final product, and in the business value chain, the way that the product undergoes from the primary production to the final applications, that can be nutraceuticals, cosmetics, whatever, it's the business value chain. Next slide, please. And here we have a picture, and this topic, I'm just finishing. This topic is very relevant in many projects discuss and speak about the value chain. This is an example of the value chain, because it is the value of the product depends on the position in the value chain. In the early stage of value chain, either business value chain or product value chain, the product has a lower value. So it is important to increase the position in the value chain. So, for example, the algae market is completely different when we consider in the beginning of the value chain, when it's in the factory, in the production unit, when the algae are produced, they have a certain value. But then when they are incorporated in products, in the final applications, if you consider the algae market, it's multi-billion dollars, while in the production is much lower. So the value increases along the value chain. That's why it's important to study and to consider the value chain. Right? Next slide, please. As a conclusion, I would say that it's very important to understand these two types of value chains. The product value chain, where we have the paste, dried or extract, and we have the business value chain, where we have from the biomass to the final applications and final products. So my 10 minutes are over. That's all. Thank you. Next slide, just to finish. Thank you. Bye-bye.